What are UFOs? Do aliens exist? Have they been here before? These are all questions that researchers in the field of ufology hope to someday definitively answer.
Ufology has always been really fascinating to me because there are these things that are going on that we get these tiny glimpses of. It's easy to think somebody's crazy, but it takes more time and thought to think, could there be something more to this?
Government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, and for much of the early 90s my job there was to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon. My father was a senior government scientist, director of the Royal Aeronautical Establishment at Farnborough, and Ministry of Defence was almost the family business, so you could say that I just joined the family firm.
I'm one of these people who has a big passion and interest in UFOs, but I've never actually had a UFO encounter. I got interested because my father was in the British Royal Air Force and he was a radar mechanic, and he was involved in 3 UFO encounter incidents in September 1952. Interestingly enough, this was at the height of a NATO operation called Exercise Mainbrace. And it was a show of strength to the Russians. You know, you try anything, we've got all this to fire back at you. And over the course of 3 nights, UFO activity was reported by the personnel out on the operation. And so aircraft were scrambled, fighter planes. Some of the pilots reported seeing like classic 1950s era Day the Earth Stood Still flying saucers. Others saw these bright lights in the sky, brilliantly bright lights. Everybody was told, you won't talk about this. And my dad didn't tell anyone until I was about 12. And it got me interested, not because it was my own father, but because he was also trained in the military as a radar mechanic.
Ufology is the study of reports, visual records, and other phenomenon related to unidentified flying objects.
Well, I think what attracts me to this is that my thing is really ancient aliens, but on other planets. If you look at the moon or you look at Mars, you can see clear evidence of structures of manufactured buildings and pyramids and all kinds of stuff, signs of ancient civilizations on other planets.
UFO reports have been subject to various investigations over the years by governments, independent groups, and scientists.
But if I just find one artificial structure on Mars, okay, I've proven that either human history is completely different than they've taught us, and we were there on Mars a long time ago, the whole Atlantis thing, and our civilization fell and now it's rising back up, or I've proven that aliens exist, one of the two. So that's what attracted me to that line of things, the Eric von Daniken, Richard Hoagland line of thinking, is because it's provable.
Ufology as a field has not really been embraced by academia and is largely considered a pseudoscience by the scientific community and mainstream media. So who are the people who champion and dedicate their lives to this field of research? What compels them to keep going in the face of derision and hardship?
I wasn't that good a student at school, didn't know what I wanted to do. And as fate would have it, I got a job on like a What's On guide in the local town I was living on. I did a lot of the music stuff. After working for this magazine, which was called Zero, for a couple of years, I thought, well, why not try and expand and take the journalistic approach I've done on the magazine, but combine it with research into UFOs, take that journalistic approach with aliens. So I've been sort of actively doing research for about 30 years.
With new reports and sightings mounting on almost a daily basis, And with many mainstream media outlets reporting on the phenomenon, perception is beginning to change.
Yeah, I was about 12 years old. I was at Boy Scout camp, and we were taking a shortcut up for lunch because we were really hungry, and I was with 3 other kids. So there were 4 of us all together, and this one guy knew of a shortcut, and I could take you there today. It was at Camp Horseshoe, Rising Sun, Maryland, and it was this kind of an uphill dry creek bed, boulder to boulder, so it was really kind of fun. And it was like either in the early spring or early fall, but the bottom line was we were, single file hopping from boulder to boulder, and one of the kids goes, "Wow, what's that?" And the other kids go, "Whoa, what is that?" And I go, "Where?" And they go point, and they go, "Oh my gosh, what is that?" And we're looking at the classic UFO, the classic disc hovering in the sky, the sunlight glinting off of it for, I would say, at least 20 seconds. And we're looking at this thing, and it just goes like this. Just like, you could follow it, but it was just like, and it was gone. We go running back to the camp. "We saw a UFO, we saw a flying saucer." All the kids are gathered around us, the scoutmasters come out, oh, that type of thing. And we told the story, and they were all laughing at us. And we went to lunch, and they laughed more. And by the dinner hour, the other 3 boys, "Oh, we just made it up." And I just sat there and went, "No, we didn't. We didn't make anything up. I know what I saw." It was my first lesson in herd mentality and groupthink and how dangerous that is. And so I've always been, anytime I get a whiff of groupthink, it's just like, I'm instantly repelled by it.
The UFO subject matter is sort of the gateway drug to so many other venues of what is reality, what are we doing here on this planet, asking the big questions. My curiosity got weaponized, as my good friend Jeremy Corbell would say, when I saw some craft in the sky, a daytime sighting back in 2007. There was a number of just kind of like white specks in the sky. Started off with just a handful, and then they started showing up more and more. The whole sky was sort of peppered with them, and I was like, what the hell is going on here, right? I thought for sure it was going to make the mainstream news that night and next day, and there was nothing there. And checking the internet, checking, the 7 o'clock news, I thought for sure everybody should have seen this event. Nothing happened, but I kept researching because I was, baffled at what I saw, and I wanted to know more.
Ufologists come from all walks of life. One thing that they all seem to have in common is a passion for the subject. But of course, not everyone in this field started out as a believer.
When I grew up, the UFO phenomenon was really not something that was looming large in my awareness. So when I joined the Ministry of Defense, and then when I got posted into the UFO project, I had no real in-depth knowledge about UFOs. This, to me, was just a government job, a pretty strange one. I wasn't even really sure what the deal was. That I knew we did it, but I wasn't quite sure how or why. I went into the job, certainly, and in the individual investigations, we got about 200 or 300 cases each year. I went in certainly with an open mind, but I think intellectually it was difficult not to have the view that, look, we're probably going to find an awful lot of aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteorites. Of course, that's exactly what we did find. The vast majority of sightings we found either had a conventional explanation. The people were sincere enough, but they misidentified something.
I don't think I would ever call myself a skeptic of the phenomenon, but I've been a skeptic of certain cases.
80% of the cases we found that we were dealing with misidentifications of known objects and phenomena. In 15% of the cases we had insufficient information to make an assessment. In 5% of the cases, unknown. Now, it was important to say, of course, unknown did not mean extraterrestrial spacecraft. I mean, we constantly had to push back against this kind of UFO equals aliens equation, which is totally bogus. I mean, people say, do you believe in UFOs? It's a meaningless question. You can't not believe in UFOs. I mean, these are literally, by definition, things people see and can't explain. Most of them have conventional explanations, some don't. With the ones that don't, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is one of a number of competing theories, and absolutely we considered that, We didn't rule it out, but neither did we have any definitive evidence that could prove it.
I've even seen things in the sky that I'm like, okay, what the heck was that? You know, so to deny it would be essentially like denying a part of myself and my entire existence, and it doesn't feel right.
Exactly, there's nothing to believe. It was all very real. You know, it's not like a religion, something that you have to be trained to believe. I'm now 70 years old and I teach my students incredible experiences, breed incredible people that have incredible wisdom to share. All over the course of my entire life, I've been touched by the divine, and to these days I do not know if it's a curse or a blessing, because the legacy that all those experiences brought me is just mind-boggling.
Two things, I think, began to challenge my natural skepticism with some of this. Firstly was delving into the archive of previous files. Now, the Ministry of Defence had had a UFO program since 1953. Before that, there had been sightings dating back certainly to the Second World War. And of course, we had a vast archive of documents going back decades on all of this. And I made it my business, when time permitted, of course, to dive into that archive to try and educate myself about the history of our program. I didn't want to spend time reinventing the wheel. What did we already know? What information did we already have on this? Could we find patterns, for example, trends? That was the first thing, and I began to realize that just as with the day-to-day sighting reports that were coming in, just as most of them had explanations, but some didn't, going back through the archives, we had some pretty interesting cases in there which challenged me. The other thing that I think really made even more of an impression was sometimes a case would come your way that you would just say, wow. And one in particular from 1993, we had a wave of sightings that took place over large parts of the UK over a period of 6 hours. We had police witnesses, we had military witnesses. I had people describing to me vast triangular-shaped craft moving very slowly, and then in an instant accelerating away to the horizon at high Mach speeds. And I had people say to me, Air Force witnesses, say, look, Nick, I work at an air base. I've been in the Air Force 8 years. I've never seen anything like this in my life. And so when you have things like that, when you do the investigation, you build up a picture of the particular incident. When you talk to the witnesses and get their story. I mean, one person I remember literally hours later, him relaying something and his voice still shaking with emotion. Serious career Air Force officer who is obviously around fast jets, fast attack helicopters all the time, but not the sorts of people to be impressed easily by speeds and accelerations. So when those sorts of people get impressed, I listen. I received about 200 or 300 cases each year, though in some other years it went as high as 700 or 800. Now, most of those reports came from the public, but some came from pilots, police officers, military personnel, radar operators, and it was those sorts of people that we paid more attention to. Now, that's not to say, I don't want to sound patronizing here, and it's ridiculous to think no good information can come from the public, particularly if you're trying to do a proper intelligence assessment, where the thing is you're not just investigating a single case, but you're trying to piece together the puzzle, draw connections, look for commonalities. And there, absolutely, you need the public reports too. But inevitably, when you get, say, an Air Force pilot sitting down and saying, okay, Nick, this is what I saw, and then when the radar operator comes forward and says, oh yeah, we tracked it on the radar too, and here's the data, that's the sort of thing that is much more interesting to me.
Well, I mean, again, it comes to, obviously Roswell's a big one, but I think you can also make a compelling argument that Roswell might have in fact been secret United States flying wing squadrons that had an accident, secret space program type stuff that happened in the desert. That's obviously a classic, but the government did come out and say we have a flying saucer, and then they retracted it. So that's what makes it, I think, really significant. In terms of other cases, Travis Walton's abduction case is unassailable because you had 5 or 6, 7 witnesses, all of whom passed lie detector tests. And I think it's really hard to argue with the evidence presented in the Walton case. So those ones are some of my favorites. Some of the other ones, Rendlesham Forest and the Phoenix Lights, I'm kind of tired of talking about them. There's nothing new on them. And they are good cases, but they're not really, to me, they're not super compelling to me anymore because I think we've squeezed all the blood out of those turnips.
The British government has fairly recently completed what was an 11-year program to declassify and release most of its UFO files. About 60,000 pages of documentation have been released, some of which was classified secret UK eyes only. A lot of the material in there is fairly mundane, people out seeing vague lights in the sky, but if you're prepared to go through that material, you will find case after case after case where you have sightings from pilots, radar operators simultaneously tracking these things, jets scrambled, pilots trying to intercept, but the UFOs performing speeds and maneuvers that seemed significantly ahead of our own capability. And those are the sorts of cases that I was most interested in. I suppose in the lifetime of the MOD's UFO program, there were probably something like 12,000 cases. So hundreds and hundreds of cases where you had good quality witnesses, pilots, police, military, radar, that sort of thing. Britain's most compelling UFO incident was probably Rendlesham Forest, December 1980. A UFO actually landed in the forest that lies between 2 military bases, Bentwaters and Woodbridge, and over 3 consecutive nights, multiple military witnesses see a UFO. On the first night it lands, and some of them get so close they touch the thing, and they even see symbols on the side. Subsequently, and we were always looking, of course, for the things that move this from beyond a story into something that can be corroborated. Well, there was a landing site, of course, so people went there and they went with a Geiger counter. Radioactivity levels were found, which were assessed by our own scientific and technical intelligence people as being significantly higher than the average background. There were indentations in the ground where this thing had apparently landed on some sort of tripod-like device. There were burn marks, scorch marks on the sides of the trees in the small clearing where this thing had come down. So there was something over and above the testimony of the military personnel themselves. On the final night of these 3 nights, the deputy base commander finally, he got fed up. He heard that the UFO had returned again, so he threw together a small team of witnesses and he went out, as he put it, to debunk this nonsense. And he ended up seeing the UFO himself. So here you have a colonel who was a complete skeptic going out to debunk the story, seeing this thing, as he put it, performing extraordinary speeds and maneuvers in the sky as if it was conducting a grid search, firing a narrow beam of light down at the ground in front of him and his team. And he said, thinking back to this, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Was this communication? What was it? He didn't know. When I asked him, what do you think it was? He says, well, Nick, he said, I don't know what it was, but whatever it was under intelligent control. And so when you have consistently cases like this, multiple military witnesses, physical evidence, and this UFO was briefly tracked on radar, but here I'm talking about the radioactivity levels at the landing site. Soil samples were taken, parts of the trees were taken back for analysis. Things like this, I think, began to change my mind. And this was a case, I did a cold case review on that. It had happened before my time, but it was the sort of thing in our files that leapt out at me and made me think, wait a minute, this is not just aircraft lights and weather balloons. There's something over and above that. There's a phenomenon that we haven't yet got a handle on. Other cases that interested me and actually caused me some considerable concern. We had a surprising number of fairly near misses between commercial aircraft and UFOs. I remember a case, Manchester, 1995, a UFO passed down the side of a commercial aircraft at a height of about 9,000 feet. The pilot and the co-pilot were so concerned that they almost instinctively flinched and ducked as this object came so close. Another time, somebody thought that maybe we accidentally fired off a surface-to-air missile or something, and the pilot again shouted, "Look out, look out," and assumed a bracing position. And these are commercial aircraft with hundreds of people on board. So, and cases like that in the British government's UFO files, other countries around the world, pilots seeing these things, radar sometimes corroborating that yes, there was an uncorrelated target. These sorts of cases moved me from just dismissing all this as nonsense to saying something's going on. I'm not saying it's necessarily extraterrestrial, though certainly can't rule that out, but something over and above just misidentifications, hoaxes, or delusions.
Who are the Men in Black?
On the matter of cases that I might have in my files and which haven't really sort of seen, the light of day, I think the ones that I've got more than anything else relate to one of my most favourite things to write about. That's the Men in Black mystery. People think of the Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, But the movies were based on real cases, but they kind of just turned it into like comedy, adventure stories. But I mean, the movies were fun, but they weren't like the real Men in Black, who are actually described as like really sort of pale-skinned and scrawny and gaunt, and they have these bulging eyes that they hide behind these wraparound sunglasses, and they don't actually look fully human. They almost look like a hybrid. And I've got a lot of cases like that where people have seen UFOs. 2 days later, there's a knock on the door, or even in the evening, and they open the door and there's this weird guy in a black suit and an old 1940s style fedora hat, looking like a mannequin out of a shop. I've got a lot of cases where people have been threatened and silenced, and also where when they're in proximity of the Men in Black, they actually felt as if they were being drained of their energy, as if they were like a psychic vampire, just draining their energy and their life force. I've got so many really weird MIB cases that some of them I've been able to put into the public domain, into books, because I've actually done 4 books on the Men in Black and 1 on the lesser known Women in Black cases, which are similar.
We did receive reports not just of UFOs, but entity encounters, close encounters of the third kind, some abduction accounts. We didn't get as many as one might suppose, and I think people reporting that were more likely perhaps to report those sorts of cases to civilian UFO research groups.
My connection with extraterrestrials started when I was 6 years old. I am what you call ADHD. I was born with a tremendous amount of physical and intellectual energy. And by the way, ADD is not a disorder. It's actually a gift. Einstein was ADD. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water. All the windows of the house were broken. Going to the attic was like going to hell for me. It was cold. And I was always hoping that before going there I could get a cat, because I could get the warmth from the cat. That night I was really upset. There was no cat, so I knew it was going to be cold. So I went to bed, and my mom was saying to me, "Louis, make sure to blow your candle, okay? We don't want to put a fire in the house." Yeah, mommy. Yeah. And in the middle of the night, first time that I dealt with extraterrestrials, I felt something on my feet. So I thought it was a cat. So I said, yes. I kick it, trying to get it to come up, because I didn't want to lose the warmth that I had accumulated into my little blanket. Didn't move. So I said, try it again. It didn't move. So I said, I have to go and get him. So I just sat on my bed and oh my God, for the first time in my life, I have seen the Greys. What I did when I first saw them, I hid it, because that's the initial response, you know. I was traumatized. What the hell is this? You know. Then I get a little bit more courageous and I kind of peep, and one of those entities was less than 2 inches from my face, big eyes. I freaked out. I literally freaked out and passed out of fright. And this happened so many times. For each time I was punished, I used to see those entities. The good thing about it is that I was okay the next day. I was always okay the next day, so I got used to it, put it this way. Incidentally, in 1956, there was quite a lot of reports coming from Russia of those type of monkey, ETs, for lack of words, to the eye of a 6-year-old. They were, you know, little monkey with big eyes. That's all I knew. So that was my introduction to the world of extraterrestrials.
Many of the people out there in the community thought that we in the Ministry of Defence already knew about all this and were actively part of a conspiracy to cover it up. If people were reluctant, as they sometimes were, fearing ridicule, fearing disbelief, not wanting to be seen to waste government time, perhaps thinking we already knew about it and were covering it up, if those people were reluctant to report a UFO, they were much more reluctant to report an entity encounter or an abduction. But we did get cases. I opened a small file to try and draw together some of this material, and that file's out there. It's pretty far out, I have to say. I wonder with some of that whether we aren't dealing maybe with imagination and delusion and perhaps hoax a little bit more than, say, the military cases where we've got the pilot testimony, the radar data, maybe we've got photographs and videos that I can then take to intelligence community imagery analysis. I can get the imagery analysis resources and capabilities put on that, and we can secure a proper scientific assessment. So you can't really do that with these close encounter of the third kind reports. So all I could really say was that, yes, we got some cases. I was aware of many more in the UFO literature, but it's the old joke in the intelligence analysis community. Interesting if true. That was about all we could say by way of an assessment.
For decades, UFO enthusiasts have claimed the government is warehousing crashed UFOs and possibly aliens at Area 51, part of an Air Force base in southern Nevada.
There's no doubt that sort of beginning in the latter part of the 1980s, the big story out of all UFO stories from that era was the Bob Lazar story.
Bob Lazar is an interesting character. Of course, in 1989, he came forward, interviewed by investigative journalist George Knapp, said, I worked at Area 51, and one of the things that I worked on there was trying to reverse engineer alien technology. And he talked about UFOs that were kept at Area 51, that maybe some of these were extraterrestrial, maybe some of these were things that we had designed ourselves, but based on alien tech. I'm going to fall back on the old intelligence analyst joke of, well, interesting if true, being about all I could say on something like that.
A lot of people may not know that Area 51 is actually a portion of what's called the Nevada Test and Training Range, the NT&T, and Area 51 is literally a portion of it. And Lazar said for a brief period he worked on trying to back engineer and understand alien technology to see if we could replicate it, probably for military purposes, because that's the inevitable way it would go. There are two avenues, if you like, that most people in ufology go down. There are those who fully believe what Bob says and those who think it's a hoax. Well, one of the interesting aspects, for me at least, is the idea that he was used as like a patsy, and he may have been used unwittingly. I don't think he was a hoax or anything like that, but I do think he could have been unwittingly used in a program designed possibly to essentially tell the Russians, hey, we've got crashed UFOs, dead aliens, we're working on super extraterrestrial, energy drives and so on, as a means to freak out the Russians. Well, how do you do that? Well, you get the ultimate patsy and you expose that person to strange craft which could have been sophisticated mock-ups, and then the Russians are like, oh my God, they really do have this. What are we going to do? We've got nothing like this. And so, well, then they send Russian agents and operatives and spies to try and figure out what's going on. And then American intelligence just sits back then, waits for these Russian guys to get too close, and then they snare them in. And no real secrets have been lost. Instead, you've reeled them in with fabricated stories of UFOs. Now, I'm not saying that is the answer, but I do think that is, to a degree, a common sense scenario that could be played out. But on the other hand, I could sit here and say, I cannot deny that there isn't crashed UFOs and dead aliens, or even live aliens at Area 51, as some people have suggested. I could be 100%, and one day, the aliens will come wobbling out of Area 51 across the desert toward us. That could happen.
It's a story that is interesting. I think we can prove that absolutely for a time he did indeed work at Area 51 as a contractor, but whether his expertise in terms of some of the exotic physics that's being talked about, I think you'd have to put him together with someone like Michio Kaku and see whether that works in terms of, does he really talk that language? With recent, I suppose, pop culture phenomena such as the Let's Storm Area 51 movement from 2019, and some of the recent revelations about the Nimitz encounter, the ATIP program, it's almost, it has, I won't say it's proven Bob Lazar's claims, but it's certainly brought him back into the spotlight, and rightly, I think it has led to a call that we reassess his claims.
In my view, one of the big problems with Area 51 is there are so many people in ufology who not only do believe or accept that there could be UFOs and aliens, dead or alive, or both, at Area 51, but they also want that to be the answer. They don't want it to be next generation stealth aircraft. Why not? But it's not as exciting as aliens. If you cross that line, you've crossed the line, and you should not cross the line. And I think there is sometimes a lack of wanting to approach every angle. Instead, I just want to look at the aspect that really excites me. And I get that. That's just human nature. Whatever the answer is that's going on in Area 51, I'll be satisfied if we can get the answers. I want the answers, not just the stories.
In the light of what we see with the videos, the so-called tic-tac, do some of Bob Lazar's claims deserve a second look? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes.
Over the years, I've sort of, I guess, you get a bit older and a little bit more cynical, but you don't lose the enthusiasm for it. I do sometimes think if the whole Area 51 is like a mind game kind of scenario for obscure disinformation, counterintelligence operations, maybe one day, the aliens will be reeled out, the UFOs will be reeled out, and we'll finally know that Area 51 really is like, a place, an area where the aliens really exist, and according to some, sit around guzzling strawberry ice cream, which is one of the theories that's been around for a long time. They love strawberry ice cream. I'm like, what's wrong with chocolate ice cream,
Up until December 2017, if you had asked the United States government for a line on UFOs, what do you think? What do you know? You would have been told this: nobody's interested in this subject, nobody's investigating. Nobody has investigated since the end of 1969, when the old United States Air Force program Project Blue Book was terminated. It turns out that that was not correct. In December 2017, the New York Times published a story exclusively revealing that despite the denials, the United States government did have a program looking at UFOs. And this was called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. A UFO program so cleverly concealed it didn't have the phrase UFO anywhere in its title. Now, in parallel with the revelations about ATIP, emerged a story of something that had certainly interested ATIP and been investigated by them. Some sightings involving the US Navy, and specifically 3 videos of Navy jets chasing UFOs. There were 2 separate incidents. One had happened in 2004 on the west coast of the US and involved the USS Nimitz. The second incident had taken place on the east coast in 2015. Now, these 3 videos were made public, and they fundamentally changed the narrative about the UFO phenomenon. Previously, I think the subject was regarded as fringe. This brought it into the mainstream. Suddenly, this was being discussed not just on various sort of fun, light-hearted late-night talk shows and conspiracy blogs on the internet and things. Suddenly, it was in the Times, the Post, Politico, The Hill. It went from fringe to mainstream. And it went because of these US Navy encounters, the 3 videos, and revelations concerning the Pentagon's ATIP program. In association with this, we've seen congressional interest, the Armed Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, the Intelligence Committee. They've all taken a look at this. The President has, on 2 occasions, been specifically asked about this, and despite expressing a degree of skepticism, has said, yes, I attended a meeting on this, a briefing, and that, as he put it, our fine pilots are seeing these things. There does seem to be something a little bit different this time around, and as he put it, we're watching.
Either it's true, or somebody within the government, for reasons we don't fully understand, is playing a massive mind game. It could be we're being fed stuff to actually expose us to the fact that aliens are there. Or it could be to see how easy it is to play and screw with the human mind.
68% of people today believe that the government is withholding information about UFOs.
There are some fascinating statements that have been made about these encounters. One of my favorites actually comes from one of the pilots who first saw this, David Fravor, and he said, I don't know what it was, but I sure as heck want to fly one. And so when somebody who flies F-18 Super Hornets for a living, when someone like that gets impressed by speeds and maneuvers, then I think we should all sit up and take notice. 2 of the other statements that really struck me were in June of 2019, a number of senators went on the record as saying that they had received classified briefings on some of this. One of the senators came out of that briefing and he looked, I think, quite stunned. And he said, look, I've just had a brief, but it's classified. I can't get into any of it. Another senator came out. She said, yes, I've been briefed. Again, it's classified. I can't discuss it. But she went on to say, if you were to ask me, do I believe in UFOs? I would say, well, there are some things that have not yet been satisfactorily explained. This is unprecedented. Yes, back in the 60s, there have been some congressional hearings on this. But to have Armed Services Committee, Homeland Security Committee, Intelligence Committee, all looking at this, behind closed doors briefs where people aren't even able to come out and give you an unclassified summary. And that's telling. Normally, with most subjects, people will come out and they'll say, look, I can't go into the details because it's classified, but, you know, let me, at unclassified level, let me tell you, this is what we're dealing with. We didn't get any of that. And that's interesting.
I think there could be a mind game aspect to all of this, that A lot of people in ufology don't think about things like this. They just talk about cases. They don't think about, well, why did that retired general speak to you? Did he really just want to get it off his chest? Or was somebody guiding him to try and push you away from something that is genuinely good? A lot of people don't think about all those things, but I do.
People say that governments lie all the time. That's really not true. Certainly not in my experience. In my entire 21 years in the Ministry of Defence, I was never instructed to tell a lie. I never knowingly told a lie. If a politician in the United Kingdom was caught, say, deliberately misleading Parliament, the absolute convention was that was a resigning offence. You would have to go. Generally speaking, there'd be no way back for you. These are career-ending scenarios. That's not to say governments don't dissemble. They, maybe you could say, lie by omission. They absolutely spin. I mean, it's all about sometimes smoke and mirrors, sleight of hand, misdirection. You talk up the good news story that you want to push. You downplay or maybe even sidestep completely the bad news. But you don't outright lie. Now, I know a lot of people disagree with that. A lot of people probably watching me say this and say, oh, that's nonsense. Politicians lie all the time. But really, I don't think they do. Even when you think they do, and even when some political commentators say it was a lie, it tends not to be. It tends to be all in interpretation of details. When people say, do we have more jobs now? Are more people in employment? Well, you've got to factor in a whole bunch of variables with this in terms of the size of the working population, whether those jobs are full-time or part-time. So there's always a debate to be had. So when people say governments lie, whether it's on UFOs or anything, not in my experience, they don't. They're very clever, and sometimes you've really got to know how to speak the language, to go over things, the statements with a fine tooth comb and say, well, that's fine, but what about this? And very often if you push back against something and you're getting somewhere when someone comes back and says, oh, we don't have any further comment on that. But lies, not so much.
Well, certainly, there's stories about presidents and UFOs all along the way. We have the Richard Nixon, Jackie Gleason story where he took the famous comedian to, I think it was Eglinton Air Force Base in Florida, and showed him the frozen preserved bodies of aliens. Nixon knew about it. You can make a very strong case, as I do, that President Kennedy knew about the alien presence. You have Jimmy Carter saying he saw a UFO. You have President Reagan constantly referring to, wow, how united would we be if we were confronted with an invasion from outside?
A number of other presidents have been asked about it and have made statements. Sometimes these statements have been done after their term as president, or terms, and sometimes it's been on late night chat shows and they've kind of played it humorously.
We had President Obama was asked about aliens, and he made some joke about, oh yeah, I'll get you that stuff later. And then you have President Trump, who's been asked directly about aliens on a couple of occasions and has admitted that he's been briefed on it. So that we're in a brave new world, whether we realize it or not. I think that people underemphasize the importance of that response. No president has ever admitted that he's ever been briefed on aliens or UFOs. So that's a huge step, and I think we're just moving towards an inevitable climax where we will get something that's undeniable.
One of the most intriguing things when it comes to UFOs is that sightings are made all around the world. It's not just in the US or the UK or Australia, whatever. It's a global phenomenon.
Many other countries have UFO programs of their own. We know from both intelligence sources and from open source material like the media that many different countries have for years run programs researching and investigating. Some countries we know more about than others, but many nations have now done what the United Kingdom has done and declassified and released much of this material.
When you can put together a huge body of data where so many of the cases mirror other reports from the other side of the world and mirror cases that might be 50 years ago, then you see patterns and trends. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of the research, is not just to focus on this area or that one because it's convenient to do that, but look at how the patterns are developing elsewhere. For that reason, I think it's important to look at the global aspects of it. And that's what I've done with my latest book, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, which looks at some UFO Russian cases, but also as to how the Russians tried to manipulate the UFO phenomenon by creating bogus UFO stories to try and freak out the Pentagon.
People say this subject is very US and UK centric, and it is, because a lot of this is English speaking. Two nations that we know are doing a fair bit are Russia and China, and they're bound to be important players in this. But because of not just language, but of course the nature of those regimes and the inherent secrecy and the mistrust of the West and the lack of openness and information sharing, we really don't know much about what's going on in Russia and China, both in terms of the sightings, the casework, but also, of course, most importantly to me, in terms of what the governments know and think about the phenomenon, how they handle this in terms of policy. Geopolitics can't be taken out of the look at the phenomenon. And even amongst allies, there's surprisingly and disappointingly little collaboration. When I was running the British government's program, we didn't just pick up the phone and talk to our allies and say, send us your best cases, and pop over for meetings about what we thought. No, this was kept on a strictly national basis.
Sometimes it can be a challenge to get information from faraway nations. It's not the easiest thing to do. I mean, the UK and the US have both got Freedom of Information Acts, as has Brazil and Australia and numerous other countries as well. And you can liaise with the researchers there and share data, and that works well. But sometimes, it can be so difficult. Countries, nations are isolated. There might be just a couple of researchers in the entire country, never mind the local county or whatever. You have to push and make connections elsewhere and try and put a picture together, because I think so often what happens, you can have fragmented tales and somebody's got a little story here and there, but if you put all the material together, then you could see a pattern develop. And that's what I try and do. Look at, say, reports from India, and then the next week you look at reports from Brazil, maybe Canada next week and Argentina the next, and look at the similarities between the cases. And it's kind of like a police officer looking into a case involving like a serial killer. They look for the threads that are followed in each murder. Well, we kind of do that in ufology. You look for the similar threads.
If you look at history, if you go back hundreds of years, maybe thousands, if you get into ancient astronaut theory, the idea is that they have always been with us since the dawn of time. They've guided us, shaped us. Some people even say created us. We've worshipped them as gods, feared them as devils. You can go back hundreds of years and find various people, historical figures, who have certainly seen strange things in the sky that nowadays we would call UFOs, whether it's Alexander the Great, whether it's Constantine, whether it's Christopher Columbus. Some of these great figures have seen UFOs, and of course they didn't use that phrase. They would talk about fiery crosses in the sky or lanterns on or under the ocean. You can only use the language and conceptual ideas you have available to you. So when we say things like UFO, it's just a word, it's just a phrase, it's a label. We see these things through our individual eyes. We perceive them through our culture, our belief system. If a shadowy figure appears at the foot of your bed, if you're religious, you might think it's an angel. If you're interested in the paranormal, you might think it's a ghost. If you're interested in UFOs, you might think it's an abduction experience. So these are perhaps the same phenomena, but perceived and interpreted through the individual language, culture, and belief system of the witness.
The miracle of the sun, also known as the miracle of Fatima, is reported to have occurred on October 13, 1917, attended by a large crowd who had gathered in Fatima, Portugal. Newspapers published testimony from witnesses who said they had seen extraordinary solar activity, such as the sun appearing to dance or zigzag in the sky, careen towards the earth, or emit multicolored light in radiant colors. According to these reports, the event lasted approximately 10 minutes. Some describe it as a religious event or an act of God. Others believe it was UFOs.
It was a UFO event. We've got too much witness testimony from the handwritten 1917 documents, which are tucked away at the sanctuary in Fatima, written by Father Fiera, who was the parish priest in Fatima, who went to the witnesses and took their testimony. It's handwritten. And Fino de Armada had access to the sanctuary in the 20th century, and she took a tape recorder in and just read everything. Couldn't write, couldn't take pictures, but she just read as fast as she could into the tape recorder, and then later on would disseminate. And what she realized is that, wait a minute, the witnesses are telling us something completely different than what we've heard. The idea of a spinning sun and the miracle and the Blessed Virgin Mary, all this was basically concocted about 11 years after the event by the Catholic Church. The whole event was dressed up in the secrets of Fatima. There are no secrets of Fatima. That comes later when Lucia has been hustled off to a convent, and she's now 18, 19 years old. This happens in 28, where she begins, and guess what the first one is? Consecrating rushes to the Sacred Heart of Mary. Well, you know, this is a 3-hour theological discussion. Mary does not have a Sacred Heart, first of all. If you read the biblical narrative, she says, I'm a sinner like everybody else. So yeah, she's the God-bearer, I get all that, and she's blessed among all women. I understand that. But it wasn't Mary that appeared to the kids. The entity had a very short dress on, had this weird kind of cloak thing, and was holding some sort of a ball. All that's been dressed up. But you go back in the 1917 handwritten documents, and it's a whole different deal. We have the photograph that was taken by Joshua Benoliel in the field at Fatima in October 13th, 1917. We've got it. And just Jose Machado was the man who actually went into, he had access to the archives in Fatima and was able to handle the original glass plates, okay? And he's looking at these things, and he went on record and said that these are not chemical burns, they're not smudges, they're not scratches. This, whatever this thing is, it's intrinsic in the photograph. And there's actually 3 other photographs, which he was not allowed to reproduce, but he told us about them, that had the object in it too. And the object is clearly a disc, and it's hovering right over the apparition site. I mean, so people can do with that what they want to, but witness after witness came on the record in 1917 and stated, I looked up and saw a dull silver disc. That's what they said. And all that, of course, has been obfuscated. You never hear anything about that, but that's why we went into it. So it was a UFO event, in my opinion.
It's pretty clear that a lot of ancient texts describe what we would call today UFO sightings, flying saucers, alien spacecraft, that kind of thing. To me, it's there's no question that we've been visited for a very long time. And it does seem likely that the alien interest, the extraterrestrial interest in the human race has accelerated since World War II, for sure.
The history of the UFO phenomenon, and particularly, I suppose, ufology, has been almost like a cat and mouse struggle between the UFO community and the government. The UFO community believing that the government is gatekeeper of some huge secret too terrible to be told, and that there's a conspiracy and a cover-up, and that it's just a matter of time. If we keep pushing at this, maybe we'll break it down. And there have been various attempts to, I suppose, smash through the wall of secrecy as people perceive it. The Disclosure Project has been one such initiative. Dr. Stephen Greer certainly drew together a large number of people who had some kind of involvement with this, or claimed to have had some sort of involvement, either as on the policy side or as witnesses, but within government, military, intelligence community. Some of those witnesses, I think, were the real deal and had genuine exposure to information about this and sightings. I think there are question marks over others. But over the years, other people have stepped up too. Stephen Bassett has done a lot of work in this area. Many other figures, James Fox, Leslie Kean, people have put together events at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. to try to draw together various insiders, pilots, generals, military officers going on the record. I think all this has moved us further forward, but I think it's a mistake to regard the disclosure as a single event and a binary process.
It gets kind of complicated when you've got real cases and you've got government agencies fabricating stories as well for political reasons. But for me, that's also a fascinating aspect of it all. You just have to go where the data takes you. And I've never been someone really who has taken all this from the perspective, I think it's going to be this, so I'm going to try and prove this theory. That's the wrong way to take it. I just go where the flow goes. And that's all you can really do. And hopefully at the end of the day, you know, if we're all 6 foot underground, we get the answers, you know.
We're going to divert a little bit from the format of past press conferences.
I don't know that I believe in government disclosure, but I think the aliens are going to, land on the White House lawn at some point.
All the new revelations that are coming out daily, literally on the news and the mainstream media. I mean, this is old stuff for us researchers who've been in it for, a decade plus. But it is exciting times, and it's exciting to see the rest of the world sort of, go through what I went through a little over 10 years ago.
33% of U.S. adults believe that some UFO sightings over the years have in fact been alien spacecraft visiting the Earth from other planets or galaxies. 16% of Americans say they have personally witnessed something that they thought was a UFO.
So within 3 to 5 years, your government's going to finally tell you, we know nothing about ETs, we don't know who they are, we don't know where they came from, we know nothing about it. But they are here. And they're here to stay. And they've been here forever.
When I hear people in the UFO community talk about disclosure, they even capitalize it, disclosure with a capital D. And to them, it takes the form of the president going on television, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we are not alone. And then the secret is unpacked for everyone. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think it's as binary as that. It kind of assumes that the US government has the archetypal spaceship hidden in an Air Force hangar somewhere. I'm not sure they do. I think that, if anything, events like the Nimitz encounter, programs like ATIP, suggest to me a different scenario. A scenario where the government, the military says, yeah, sure, there is something here, there's a phenomenon, but we don't have the answer. We don't have a handle on it. We don't have crashed spaceships and dead aliens. We have something in our airspace. Our pilots see them. Our radar operators track them. Our intelligence operators try to make sense of what's happening, but we still don't really have a definitive assessment. So therefore, in that situation, I say there cannot be disclosure with a capital D, because there is nothing binary like that to disclose. So what you have is what I characterize as disclosure with a little d. And disclosure with a little d is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the revelations about the Pentagon's ATIP program. We're seeing the videos of the Navy jets chasing the UFOs. We're hearing from some of the people involved in the program. Former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who set it up. Luis Elizondo, the DIA intelligence officer who ran a lot of this. David Fravor, one of the pilots who chased these objects. All these people are coming forward. We have a paper trail now that we didn't have before. The DIA wrote to Congress about this, releasing a list of studies undertaken under the ATIP contract. None of this we had up until about 2 years ago. This is, I suspect, as good as it gets, until and unless extraterrestrials, if that's what we're dealing with, do decide to land on the White House lawn. So when people say to me, when will we get disclosure? My answer is, you're getting it right now.
Well, the sightings are coming out, weekly. There's something on mainstream media covering sightings. Nimitz, the Tic Tac shaped UFO, happened well over, I think, in 2004. And, Commander David Fravor is the pilot that chased this thing. And you hear him go, whoa, that whole deal, got it. He says that. And, he's on Tucker Carlson. And it begs the question, Nick Pope and I sat down and talked about this thing. They are rolling this out. How does someone like Nick Fravor wind up on Tucker Carlson? This guy's a nobody. He doesn't have a book. He doesn't have a DVD. He's a nobody. He's not on any type of a circuit. Not doing any of this stuff. How does he get on Tucker Carlson? But he's there because he's a useful tool in the toolbox, as Nick Pope explained yesterday. And they took out the hammer and said, okay, go for it. And that was disclosure, 2017. And since then on Tucker Carlson, they've been revealing the so-called extraterrestrial presence, which of course I believe is interdimensional and is part of the coming Great Deception.
One of the biggest problems and challenges that we have in the UFO field is when it comes to the issue of what's real and what isn't. We know there are genuine, really cool, good, solid UFO cases, but at times government agencies have tried to muddy the waters by creating bogus stories and then revealing them as bogus stories, and that kind of makes people, they feel like, well, why should I keep doing it? It's just garbage. But it's actually just government manipulation and trying to sort of lower people's sense of excitement and vision for all this. And I think at times government agencies do this really well. They build something up and then, well, it was just a hoax after all, and everybody gets kind of really down. And I think that's the whole point. This is like a battle against ufology to get us to stop what we're doing, just by purely making us think, is it really worth it? Well, at the end of the day, it is worth it, but you have to find a way to dig through the real stuff and the disinformation and the bogus material. And sometimes that can be a big problem, because some of the big disinformation stories are the really amazing, exciting stories that people don't want to give up on. And I'm sure these agencies recognize that. There's a lot of manipulation of the UFO research community to prevent us from getting the answers. But the important thing of all of this is that the government agencies would not be putting out disinformation if there wasn't a real phenomenon. That's what it actually comes down to, and that's an important thing.
When it comes to governments and UFOs, there are all sorts of rumors and accusations out there, misinformation, disinformation. There are characters in this story, people like Richard Doty, who claim to have a Air Force Office of Special Investigations background, who say that they worked at some point on maybe putting false information into the public domain on this subject to lead people down the wrong paths. What I will say is this, that certainly over the years, it does seem that there have been instances where, for example, governments would be almost promoting an extraterrestrial narrative to hide the reality that in some of these cases it's our own technology. So for example, in the 60s, when pilots were seeing and reporting things like the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, it suited the CIA and the United States Air Force for any media reports about this to come out as flying saucer reports, as opposed to a report of an astonishing looking next generation aircraft. Does that mean that on occasion the government has itself fueled the fire when it comes to the UFO phenomenon and the narrative? Maybe.
49% of Americans think that beings somewhat like ourselves exist somewhere in the universe. Even more, 75% believe that some form of life exists on other planets.
So for me, it's mainly UFOs and cryptozoology, and that sometimes there's a crossover between the two. Of all the things that are going on, you know, two's plenty. Now, I don't want people to think it's a job, it's a passion, but it's a passion where I think you also need time away, because I do know sometimes nightmare stories of people who it becomes an obsession to the point where it actually affects their lives and marriages and things, because that obsession quite literally takes over. And I can see how easily that can happen, but for me, I have to have time to see what's going on with the soccer, you know, and never mind UFOs now and again.
Yeah. The cool thing is I come from a different perspective, and most people in that audience have never heard it. But I go really slowly, and I speak in a language which I think people can understand. I didn't mention the word Jesus until the very, very end, and then I revealed the goods. But it took me 3 sessions to get there. I talk about my spirit guide, which is the Holy Spirit, the Great Spirit, the Holy Ghost. That's who my spirit guide is. But if I say the Holy Ghost, or if I say the Holy Spirit, click, they won't listen. But if I say my spirit guide, which is what he is, right, they instantly relate. They instantly relate. So I'm not trying to be deceitful. I'm trying to speak in a language that I can communicate with the UFO community with. I've seen two myself. I come from that world. My third eye was open. I was in an ashram for 3 years. I mean, I did the whole deal. I mean, I was immersed in it. So I have a very unique perspective in looking at all this, and I'm a frank supernaturalist. I believe that the supernatural is more real than the natural world, and I've encountered it, and you know, I encounter it all the time, and I mean that, all the time. When the Spirit of a living God speaks, you know, I've learned to listen. That's a process in itself.
Certainly this kind of interaction, to talk with people, to hear their stories, to collaborate other people's stories, to then also verify some of my own experiences, you know, like I'm not crazy, I saw these things in the middle of the day. Having an open mind and venturing into this world and having these experiences and interactions is a key part of it.
I have an interesting relationship with the UFO community. Because I did this for the government, I think people are very polarized about me. A lot of people are very grateful, and they'll say thank you for this great information, because of course I don't just give people the information, I show them or tell them where they can get it. And it's not just a story, it's something that can be verified in the National Archives, by going to the electronic reading rooms of various government agencies, by confirmation from the public affairs offices. So a lot of people in the UFO community are grateful that I've helped them maybe make this more credible by being maybe a communicator on this issue in some of the mainstream media work that I do, and by helping them find verifiable information. On the other hand, there are a lot of people in the UFO community who think that I'm still secretly working for the government, that I'm part of either a disinformation campaign, or flipping it the other way around, that I'm part of a campaign to acclimatize people to the reality of this ahead of an official announcement. But either way, of course, when you believe that someone's still secretly working for the government, they become the bad guy. So I know that I'm the bad guy to a lot of people in the UFO community. Well, that's fine. It's difficult, if not impossible, to prove a negative. So I'm not sure there's anything I could do to dissuade people who think I am still secretly working for them. It's all disinformation. I don't think there's anything I can do. If they want to believe that, fine. All I can say is, honestly, I'm not. But if they believe that, they wouldn't believe my denial, would they? So I have mixed experience, I think, with the UFO community. And again, as with maybe a lot of fringe topic. There's no getting away from the fact that there are some out and out crazy people and fraudsters in this community. However, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Most of the people in the community are honest, sincere, dedicated, hardworking, professional at what they do. They are genuinely interested and genuinely doing their best to uncover, as they would see it, the truth, whatever that truth may be, wherever their journey takes them. You can't, like myself, have run a government UFO program without finding yourself cast by different parts of the community as hero or villain.
Even as most Americans are skeptical that aliens have visited Earth, the majority, 56%, believe that those who spot UFOs are seeing something real, not just imagining it.
And then came the ultimate UFO experience, and I have the proof. It was during the solar eclipse in 2012. My wife, she wanted to take pictures of the solar eclipse. And I said, well, you can do that, but don't look, whatever it is. And then she went, chung, 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 6 times. She took 6 shots, and I was going, what are you doing? Because she was looking through it, and I was afraid for her eyes. And oh my gosh, when we developed these pictures, you could see Draco. It's a orb, and believe me, you cannot duplicate this, regardless how good you are with Photoshop. You could see that orb coming to me, getting closer and closer and closer, entering my third eye and coming out of my heart. And since that day, I have been making predictions that are well documented, dated, and unarguable about earthquakes above 6.0. I was on George Norrie, 40 million people listening to me. I said, be ready for fire, and we're going to lose a hell of a lot of wildlife. A week and a half later, Australian fire killed millions of animals. And I said, be careful, there is a new disease coming for the lungs, and next thing you know, norovirus. I give the exact date for 9/11 with all the details. I gave exact dates for terrorist attack, which brought the FBI twice in my house. Believe me, extraterrestrials are master of matter, master engineer from the extreme. They do not care who you are. If you're the president, they don't care of your education. They do not care of your position. They have lost something that people like me were born with. They have lost the spirit. They have lost their identity. They have lost their connection with God and the divine. And humanity is moving in that direction. And that's why everything is rational and is practical. Because the more you delegate with the tree, the less you're going to see the forest.
There are many, many fascinating cases I've come across. Some fairly well known, some less well known, some not known at all. I mean, I think you could go, for example, through the declassified archives of Ministry of Defense files, and you could pull out something almost at random and say, wow, that's interesting. I mean, we had some amazing cases. We had a great case, for example, where a UFO was seen to come down, and the witnesses thought that it had landed in a field. They went to the field fully expecting to see something like out of Close Encounters. UFO sat on or directly above the ground. No UFO, but in the middle of the field, all the cows had congregated and stood in a perfect circle, facing each other, completely silent. So you dip into the Ministry of Defense files and you can find cases like that. You can go into the UFO literature and you can find the well-known cases, but you can find more obscure ones that really make you think. One thing that's caught my eye recently is that, and I think people have missed this, because we use the phrase UFO, we think of things in the air, but there have been many, many cases of UFOs seen either under the water, And I've spoken to witnesses who talk about some extraordinary encounters of UFOs under the water, UFOs transitioning from water to air, air to water, UFOs apparently drawing up water. So many of these so-called USO, unidentified submerged objects, many of those cases have kind of gone unnoticed, maybe until the Tic Tac incident. And that's kind of focused people's attention. But we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's the first time that a UFO has ever been seen moving apparently seamlessly from air to water, water to air. And of course the physics involved and implied by something like that is interesting. So you can almost at random sometime pick a country, pick an archive, and go and find interesting things that have maybe not been talked about much, because everyone of course has their favorite cases, their flagship cases, Rendlesham Forest, Roswell, whatever it may be, the Phoenix Lights, Stephenville, Travis Walton, many different cases. But sometimes I think the lesser known or the completely unknown ones are more interesting. You've just got to dig and maybe find some interesting diamonds in the rough.
This stuff is really, it's complex, but a good student can unravel the mysteries that are there. And look, I don't know it all. I don't have all the mysteries unraveled. Nobody does. But that's why we're on the trail, because life is for learning.
To me, the questions, are we alone or not in the universe? Are we being visited? Those are some of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves. Why wouldn't we want to get the answers to those questions? Is there a God? Does consciousness survive death of the physical body? Those are probably unknowable. But the question of, is there extraterrestrial life, might be something that actually surprisingly quickly and easily we might get a definitive answer. That interests me. I mean, philosophy, hypothesizing, interests me, but at the end of the day, that's just belief. What intrigues me is the possibility of getting definitive, testable, repeatable proof on the extraterrestrial question that would tell us, yes, there are other civilizations out there. The technology, could that give us, for example, solutions to problems that we have here on Earth? More generally, if we could either talk to other civilizations or access data about other civilizations, perhaps through picking up messages and signals, could we learn things that might help us, again, overcome some of the problems we face here? Disease, poverty, prejudice and hatred. How, if there are other civilizations who've evolved and become more advanced than us, did they face those same problems and overcome them? And if so, how did they overcome them? Is there something, some tangible, whether it's technology or whether it's almost a philosophy, a political system, whatever it is there something we can learn? And again, I find this incredibly interesting, and my goodness, isn't it high stakes? At the moment, we have all our eggs in one basket here on planet Earth. One global pandemic, one big enough comet or asteroid strike, one nuclear war, and that's it. The human adventure ends. Someday, just through the natural life cycle of the stars, our sun will grow hotter and expand, and life on Earth will be impossible. So at some point, we have to develop viable interstellar travel. This is why I'm interested in ufology and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, even though I'm no longer involved for the government. Because, as I say, these are not only the biggest and profound questions we can ask ourselves, but these are questions of existential importance.
If we're going to get the answers, we've just got to keep pushing. You know, I've seen so many people, you know, they get into it at 20, 40, they're disillusioned, and 50, they're like, why did I waste that time? You know, but I don't look at it like that. I look at it that we're pursuing a major, incredible phenomenon, and to give up after this time or that time is just ridiculous, you know.
I don't know how we could exist without beliefs. How can you have a thought without a belief? It would be nothing. It would be nothing. Everything starts with a belief.